Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is James E. McWilliams, Associate Professor of History at Texas State University. He specializes in early American history and the environmental and agricultural history of the United States. McWilliams, a former fellow in agrarian studies at Yale University, is the author of 4 books on food and agriculture, including Just Food, Where Locavores Get It Wrong and How We Can Truly Eat Responsibly from 2009, as well as A Revolution in Eating, How the Quest for Food Shaped America from 2005. McWilliams' articles and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, and on Slate.com, among others. McWilliams blogs at Freakonomics.com and at The Atlantic. In 2001, McWilliams won the Walter Muir Whitehall Prize in Early American History, awarded by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. And in 2009, he won the Hyatt Prize in the Humanities from the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. McWilliams gave a talk titled Thinking Beyond the Food Movement, 4 Big Ideas About Food and Sustainability, at the UO on April 26th in Eugene and in Portland the following day. His talk was the Oregon Humanities Center 2010-11 Criticos Lecture and was part of the year-long sustenance series. James, welcome to UO Today.
Thanks for having me.
We're really glad to get you to talk a little bit in this format as well as giving your lecture here on campus.
I'm absolutely happy to do it.
And you know, Eugene and all of Oregon has been eagerly awaiting your arrival.
I've been warned. Yeah, I've been told how brave I am to come here and deliver a message critical of the sustainable food movement.
Well, as long as you brought your flak jacket, you'll be fine. But I also think that this is a place where you are going to find a lot of informed interlocutors, so it should make for lively conversation.
Good, good.
Your newest book, Just Food, has a pun in the title, and as you explain it, it's not just about only food, but it's also about food justice, right?
That's right. You know, one of the reasons why I wrote the book was I was getting wrapped up in a lot of the locavore movement happening around me in Austin, Texas, and was really enthralled with a lot of the ideals. And I realized that, you know, I was pursuing a sort of justice when I was supporting local farms and going to farmers markets and supporting CSAs. But at the same time, I felt, as I looked around, that for a lot of people, food was just food. It was not any big deal. It wasn't a way to be an activist. It was something that people really rarely thought about, and frankly, we're never going to put a whole lot of thought into. And this worried me a little bit because food justice, as I was narrowly defining it, wasn't dealing with the big issues when it came to food. And to me, as I started to take a broader look at what was happening globally with respect to food and food production, I realized that what was happening locally wasn't in any way bearing on these larger global concerns. And as I started to look at the demographics, predicted increase in population to 9 billion people, the fact that there's very little arable land left globally for us to expand upon, the impact of climate change, and started to add up all these factors, I realized we're staring into the face of a potential global food crisis. What am I doing about that? What kind of thought on the local level are we putting into that? And I really saw a disconnect and backed away a little bit from the locavore movement and started to examine what it was about, while at the same time asking myself, how can we take some of the very good ideas at the core of the locavore movement and think about them in a global context?
So you saw people buying food and just not really thinking about the global consequences of how it was marketed and
it was
how
an
it's
insularity
produced.
that I started to see. I mean, most of the people who are supportive of local food movements and sustainable food movements are generally people who can go to a regular grocery store and eat a remarkably healthy diet of relatively fresh foods. We are in very good shape. But the fact that there are 3 billion people over the next 40 years that are going to be trying to eat like we do, an industrialized diet, given the fact that we're going to have 2 billion more people added to the face of the earth, most of them in developing countries, it seems like we need to turn our attention to those people and ask what kind of diets they should be eating and how we're going to actually bring production levels up to a point where we can feed the world a healthy, accessible, diverse diet and do so in a sustainable way. And what was happening locally, and really in no way was bearing upon that. I found lots of people deeply concerned about whether their port came from 200 miles or 50 miles away. And to me, that's kind of a boutique concern, given the global perspective on the major food problems that we're looking at in the 21st century.
So while there is a certain amount of disregard or just not paying attention, you've also discovered, in fact you discovered very quickly, that a lot of people feel very strongly about this, right? You wrote an op-ed piece in the Times in 2007 that I understand had a pretty big reaction.
Yeah, my editor at the time said the only other issue that generated this kind of vehement response, both positive and negative, was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was kind of a surprise to me. I'm a historian. I've done most of my work in archives, and to wade into the public sphere like that with such a hot button issue really opened my eyes to the fact that, you know what, this is an issue that people deeply care about. And it's one of the reasons why, when that 2007 op-ed came out, and the op-ed just sort of was critical of the locavore movement from an energy usage perspective. It challenged the claim that eating locally necessarily reduced your carbon footprint. And I basically just summarized one study. I mean, from my perspective, it was a pretty innocuous article, but the response really was quite passionate. And that, in a lot of ways, motivated me to start taking a closer look at a lot of the other sort of nuggets of conventional wisdom at the core of the sustainable food movement. And, frankly, what I found was there was a tremendous amount of wonderful ideas there, but also they were a lot more complicated than the popular media was portraying them. So I kind of took it upon myself to become a journalist for a while and really examine some of these core ideas to the sustainable food movement and write about them in public venues rather than in academic journals. And so, for better or worse, I kind of moved myself to the center of a kind of maelstrom.
How long did it take to research and write the book?
Well, I was sort of inadvertently doing research for the book before I even knew I was going to write the book. But I would say it took me about 3 years to research and write the book, which by historian standards is remarkably fast. But it was a very different kind of research than historical research. It was fascinating research. It was intense research, but it didn't require me to dive into archives and go through dusty folders for several years. And so yeah, about 5 years total.
You make the point in the book, in your introduction, that in fact that you found that you had touched upon this area where people have particularly vehement and deeply held convictions, that it's almost analogous to religion. People really deeply believe in a lot of these tenets. That must account for some of the big reactions you get?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting phenomenon in that when we're talking about food, we're really talking about many, many other things. And I think a lot of the passion behind the locavore movement or the sustainable food movement, a lot of the passion comes from that fact that food is identity for people, food is religion for people, food is something that they have very, very deep personal beliefs about. And I think that this was something I had to learn over time. I, for whatever reason, am not somebody who necessarily roots my identity in food. It's certainly important to me, but I really did come to realize that this is politics for people. People who are supporting local food aren't just supporting it for the environmental benefits. It's their way of being critical of neoliberalization or globalization. So there's a lot more there, and that does account for much of the passionate response that my book has generated, and I welcome that. I mean, this is part of the learning process that we have, or at least certain groups of people have, very much taken food and allowed it to become something more than just food, and that to me is a very interesting phenomenon, one that I'm still trying to honestly understand.
As well as it being deeply tied to politics, it also seems to be very much tied to people's personal disciplines and practice, so the way it shapes our own daily lives. And it had a big impact on you, right? You changed how you eat.
Absolutely. The research that I did on meat production led me to really make some choices about how I was going to eat. And eventually I found myself really looking into various ways in which meat was produced or could be produced. And going into the grocery store became a kind of terrifying experience because I didn't have the information that I wanted to have about the meat that I wanted to buy. And eventually I just decided, it would be much easier if I just didn't eat any of it. And I initially made this decision on purely environmental grounds because the evidence is overwhelming that, moving from a meat-based diet to a plant-based diet, if you're concerned about lowering the carbon footprint of your diet, that is the single most important thing that you can do. So I had no doubts about the environmental justification for this, and it also just was easier for me. Instead of splitting all these hairs and trying to get information that was very hard to get at, I just cut it all out. And then after a while, I started to really get into some of the animal rights literature. And this doesn't make its way into his book. This really happened after the book was in production. And I started to engage some of the deeper philosophical arguments bearing on animal rights. And I found myself in the unexpected position of not being able to counter many of these arguments. And then I thought, well, until I can counter these arguments, that there perhaps could be a moral problem with eating animals or animal products. Until I can counter those, I probably shouldn't eat any of this stuff. And I went on to make a decision to cut out all animal and animal-based products from my diet. And the results have been remarkable in many ways. And you could say that this has been inadvertently my journey of making food part of my identity. But absolutely the research that I did ended up influencing me in ways that 5 years ago I never ever would have predicted.
Last year we hosted Temple Grandin, whom you may know from the animal rights movement and the humane treatment of animals as they're led to slaughter. So that's been a big topic of discussion around here. How do you respond to critics who challenge you on the premise that the Locavore movement is elitist?
Well, in other words, when I make the argument that the movement is elitist,
let me
I've tried to back
that.
away from the E word, but go ahead if you.
Well, give me another word. Tell me another word that.
Well, I just use exclusive, another E word, but the elitist argument, I have found that it simply makes people defensive and angry, and again. The learning curve for me has been quite steep on this, but I've been trying to work very hard in engaging dialogue in a way that's not threatening and doesn't cause people to be defensive. And elitist is just a word that really gets, I don't think, anybody anywhere, even though I've been known to use the word before. But there is an exclusivity to the movement that people have been critical of. And, to me, it's kind of an economic argument. If we're going to produce food in the way that many locavores want it to be produced, it's going to be more expensive for a wide variety of reasons. Growing food in a decentralized fashion on a smaller scale is going to lead to more expensive food. Now, many people will say, well, we should be paying more for food. And I can see that argument. We live in a country where I think less than 10% of the money that we make is spent on food. So I think that's easy for us to say we should be spending more on food. Hey, you know what? If your values are the way they are, well then, put your money up and pay more money to buy the food that's produced in the right kind of way. That seems fine if you're, if again, less than 10% of your overall living expenses go to food. But in other places in the world, it's 70%. Of their overall income goes to food. So I think we have to be really careful about saying that food should be more expensive. So, I guess my response ultimately is acknowledge the exclusivity of this movement. Acknowledge that this is a movement that works for some people in some places, but it has limits to how far we can universalize it. And this may be ultimately the biggest criticism I have of the Locavore movement. It's really not a criticism so much as it is an appeal to recognize limits. And I find myself listening and studying the rhetoric of the Locavore movement, and there's this sense that everybody should be doing this. But if you step outside of Eugene, Oregon, or Portland, or Manhattan, or San Francisco, or Austin even, you'll find that this is a very difficult, these are very difficult ideals to pursue in other places for economic reasons, for geographical reasons. And so we have to be willing to acknowledge the fact that this is a way of producing food that works for me and is consistent with my values and one that I will support financially. But there have to be other ways of producing food. And there has to be a recognition that keeping food inexpensive is important for the vast majority of the world.
I had to laugh when I watched a YouTube clip of a talk you gave, which you led into by saying, "I come in peace." So you've been doing a really good job reaching out and saying, "I'm not coming here to be antagonistic," but I can imagine you need to make that point over and over again.
Yeah, well, like I said, the diplomacy is I've been working on it, and I think in a lot of ways it does pay off. I mean, people are much more willing to listen if you don't appear to be insulting their beliefs.
Yeah. Now, one of the criticisms that gets leveled at your work is that you are somehow in league with the large manufacturers of chemicals, both pesticides and fertilizers. And in fact, in the book, when you're talking about agricultural chemical inputs, you say that, quote, "It's not the poison, it's the dose." That implies that a little bit of poison is okay. Is that not correct?
Well, I don't really know that you can have agriculture without some poisonous inputs. I've visited the small farms on college campuses throughout the country, and they're using some form of chemical. Maybe it's a natural chemical, maybe it's a synthetic chemical. I think this often comes from a misunderstanding of agriculture. I mean, agriculture, when you get right down to it, is the process of manipulating the environment to produce food for humans, and that is going to require inputs, chemical inputs. Call them toxins, call them poisons. But if they're used judiciously, we can minimize risks. That's the ultimate argument that I make in the book. And the vast majority of chemists and plant scientists I know would completely agree with that assessment. The other claim, though, that because I do make that argument, because I say, look, pragmatically we're going to have to deal with agricultural chemicals. Let's figure out how to deal with them as responsibly as we can. Because I make that argument, it is somehow seen as an endorsement of industrial agriculture, or an endorsement or proof that I'm somehow in league with corporations. And I find this really frustrating and interesting at the same time. It's frustrating because the only institution buttering my bread is the state of Texas, because I teach undergraduates at Texas State University. I mean, that's my interest. I have no ulterior motive here other than just being interested in this topic. So I am not in league with any corporation. I have no direct contact with any corporations. I've certainly visited these corporations at my own expense, and I've gone to Monsanto and spent a couple days at Monsanto to see what they do, but I'm not getting anything from them. And I find the claim, and it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction that I get over and over and over again, that I am a shill for corporate agriculture, to be ultimately a sign of intellectual weakness on the part of the people or the interests that I'm challenging. And so initially when I would get that reaction, I would be angry and defensive about it, but now I just see it as a sign of, well, if that's the best you can do in return, well then you've got to work on your argument a bit and come back at my argument with, more evidence, something more developed, something that's more intellectually substantial than an ungrounded claim. One other point here that I do find interesting is that I find that within the sustainable movement, there are often people who are affiliated with, let's say, free-range meat production would be an example that I've been encountering a lot lately, who get up and talk about the many, many benefits of free-range agriculture. But nobody ever calls them on having a conflict of interest. But to me, that's just as egregious a conflict of interest as somebody from Monsanto saying, hey, look at this study that we're putting out here, and look at the great benefits, and look at the pesticides that are saved by using our corn. Of course, you'd look at that and go, well, that's Monsanto. We're not going to believe that. Everybody has interests, and so I think that needs to be acknowledged when we're having these debates about food and agriculture.
So if we're talking about a free-range approach to raising meat, what are the conflicting interests in that policy?
Well, free range is a really interesting issue because I have been quite critical of it, particularly in my columns in The Atlantic, and that is immediately interpreted as me somehow supporting industrial agriculture or CAFOs and confined animal feed operations, which I'm not at all. My reasons for being critical of free-range systems and just pointing out the flaws in free-range systems is to point out that when it comes to meat production, there are always going to be inefficiencies. There are always going to be problems. Yes, there are many advantages that free-range systems have over confined systems, but it doesn't mean it's perfect. And in fact, it's far from perfect. And so what I'm trying to do with this line of attack is encourage people to eat less meat overall, which is, I think, one of the best things that we can do as consumers if we are concerned about the environment and the ethics of eating. So I don't know if you want me to get into the details of my arguments against free-range systems, but I will just say that there are documentable problems with free-range systems that many consumers who purchase free-range meat believe that they are getting a clear pass here because they're not supporting industrial agriculture. And unfortunately, and this is true throughout the world of food and agriculture, it is never that simple. Very often, and this is human nature, we want alternatives rather than sacrifice. And my argument is that when it comes to meat, again, in global perspective, there's virtually no way we're going to see real improvements in food and agriculture if we do not make sacrifices to eat much, much less of it.
You're really thorough and very eloquent on the topic of the possible downfalls of the free-range approach in your book, so we'll just refer people to the book again on that one.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you something, a detail that I picked up in the book that I'm really curious about. It came out in 2009. At that point, you said that in Europe in particular, one of the movements for labeling food was to start putting a measure of food miles on a piece of meat. Right. Has that actually happened?
The backlash against that has become quite strong, I'm happy to say. The Independent in particular, the newspaper, the London-based newspaper, really came down hard on that effort. And the reason why is the distance that food travels, and this is one of the core points I make in my book, the distance that food travels is really quite trivial if we're worrying about the overall carbon footprint of the product that we're buying. Ultimately, what matters is what we're buying rather than where it came from. And it just so happens that certain foods are produced with much greater energy inputs than other foods. Meat and meat-based products require more energy to produce. There are more stages of production, no matter how you are producing it, compared to growing vegetables. So, I'm happy to say that I think it did happen in I think some grocery chains did end up doing it for a while, but I'm not sure what's happening with it right now, but it did not take off the way it appeared that it was going to take off when I was writing my book.
Was there ever an attempt to put that kind of labeling on products in North America?
Not to my knowledge, but there are efforts right now, and I'd love to see it happen. It requires so much more research to do life cycle analysis of some of the basic foods that we purchase at the grocery store, and actually measure the carbon impact, the carbon footprint of that particular product, and put some kind of label on it, giving you some notion of how eco-correct that particular food product is. But this is down the road. It takes a very long time to do those measurements and make those assessments.
A question that will be dear to the heart of many people in Eugene and in all across Oregon: how does the backyard farmer, the person who raises chickens in the large lot behind the house, fit into this larger picture?
Well, I think it's a niche activity, and if it works for you, that's great. It's certainly a much more humane way to acquire your eggs or your meat. There's no doubt about that. In terms of welfare standards, it's a far better approach. But again, in the global perspective, we're really just talking about an activity that's right for certain people in certain places. But the decision to have a backyard chicken coop is really quite, I don't want to say irrelevant, but really quite small given the major challenges that we face with global food production. So I just see it as kind of a personal decision that has some advantages.
I'm going to put you to the test now. We're slowly beginning to run out of time. You have about 3 minutes.
Okay.
I've given you a chance to tell me what's wrong with the current system, but could you wrap up by telling me what a truly efficient and well-functioning system would look like?
Well, most importantly, a truly efficient, well-functioning system would be one that was doing something that seems like perfectly commonsensical, but it's not happening, which is one that's primarily growing a diversity of plant-based foods for people to eat. Right now, that's not happening. Right now, globally, and certainly in the industrialized parts of the world, the entirety of the food system is dedicated to animal-based agriculture. And we grow corn, we grow soy, we feed it to animals, and then we eat the meat. This is inherently inefficient. So the first thing that should happen, I think, is moving towards, as exclusively as we can, a plant-based system of agriculture that's diverse, mid-size, if not large, and that is growing food, a diversity of food for people to eat. That is one thing that could happen. The other thing that I think has to happen is we have to move towards a cautious and judicious and federally funded and supported embrace of technologies that enable us to produce more food on less land. This is a critical issue. This is something that the sustainable food movement is not addressing. So I think we need to pursue judicious applications of biotechnology. I think we need to pursue the subsidization of fertilizers that do not run off at the rates that current fertilizers run off. Precision farming is something that's incredibly expensive to do, but it allows farmers to use their chemicals and their resources far, far more strategically than they do right now. And then finally, I think we have to deal with externalities. We have to force farmers and food corporations to pay for the pollution that they generate when they produce food. We need to put a price tag on air and soil and water and ask the corporations that are growing our food to pay for those. And I guarantee you will see food production systems change dramatically to reduce those costs.
That was a great summary. Well done.
Thank
That's really terrific.
you.
You lead into the book by using a Byzantine proverb that reads, I think if I get it right, he who has food has many problems. Certainly, at least you've proved that he who has food has much to think about.
Absolutely, yeah.
James, thanks for coming to talk to us.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
So did I. Thank you. We've been speaking with James E. McWilliams, Associate Professor of History at Texas State University and author of Just Food, Where Locavores Get It Wrong and How We Can Truly Eat Responsibly. He gave a talk titled Thinking Beyond the Food Movement, 4 Big Ideas About Food and Sustainability at the UO in Eugene on April 26, 2011, and in Portland the following day. His talk was the Oregon Humanities Center 2010-11 Criticos Lecture and was part of our year-long sustenance series. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.